Just now, Swami Kanthananji illustrated very beautifully how it is important for us to surrender ourselves completely to the will of God. Otherwise, how one single action can lead to different kinds of complications. So if we do not want to get into that kind of complication, the best thing is to leave everything to God, to the will of God. So then alone, if we are able to act according to the will of God, without any kind of sense of that ego, complete self-surrender, then alone we can escape from the consequences of this karma, cycle of karma. So to do that, this self-surrender, that is what is very important. Surrender ourselves to the will of God. How that happens? For that, we have to develop the devotion to God. Developing devotion to God. We hear so many things about spiritual life. We read so many things about spiritual life through different books, scriptures. And then, ultimately, where do we stand? Many times what happens, we start thinking about this spiritual life in a very, very complicated manner. In fact, spiritual life is simple. But then, for us who are educated, who have read lot of books, etc., no simple thing appeals. Only when we are told about the Dravida Pranayama, usually we do the Pranayama like this. So Dravida Pranayama means taking the hand like this and doing. And only then we can understand, oh, you have done something. So that is why there are so many, theories and other things that are coming. And many of us get fascinated with, that kind of practices and all. But in fact, the spiritual life is very simple. You have to stick to the basics. So basics are the things, whenever we want to do something, we start somewhere. Say for example, if we have to learn a language, we start with alphabets. They are the basics. And if we don't know the basics, then what happens? It is like a superstructure without proper foundation. If you build a huge building, but if the foundation is not strong, what happens? Building is going to collapse. The same way these things also happen. Now how we are neglecting these basics in simple things, I would like to tell you just one example. In our Institute of Languages, we teach German language. German language has got lot of similarity with our Indian languages, Sanskrit or Telugu. And our teachers, when they start teaching, they want to explain, point out the similarity between our languages and this German language. When they try to explain something about Telugu language, some portion of the grammar, they come and tell me, Swamiji, our students don't understand even Telugu language properly. Their own mother tongue. They don't know the basics of Telugu language. Remember, they are not primary school children, don't come there, master degree holders. The problem is that they don't know the basics of, their own mother tongue. Now, above that, when you try to build up the language, then what happens is that once I wanted to get a very simple passage from English to be translated to Telugu. And in our institute, there are at least, 30 teachers who are well versed in English language. But then all of them refused, telling very clearly, Swamiji, I don't know Telugu language properly. Remember, at least 25 of them, their mother tongue is Telugu. They told me, Swamiji, I cannot do it because I don't know Telugu language. Now this is the problem, whole problem. In the same way, in our spiritual life also, if we forget the basics, which are very important, then ultimately if we try to build the superstructure, which ultimately leads to different kinds of confusion. And what are those basics? Simple things, they are not very complicated one. But then we must sincerely follow them. Now when we study the Narada Bhakti Sutras, in the beginning itself know how to develop bhakti and those ideas come. For the spiritual life, what are the things that are basics? Narada first of all points out that Tasmin Ananyata. That means we must have love towards God. If you want to practice spirituality, loving God is very important. Without that, if we try to follow spiritual life, all our effort will be in developing love towards God. All our effort will end up in only making an effort to develop love towards God, because without that, no spiritual practice will be successful. So that is why, first of all, Narada points out, Tasmin Ananyata. You must develop that Ananya Bhakti towards God. What is this Ananyata means? Do we really believe? Do we have that conviction? God is my Father. Tvameva Mata cha Pita Tvameva. Tvameva Manduscha Sakha Tvameva. God is my mother. God is my relative. God is my all in all. First of all, we have to ask this question. That is the beginning. Beginning of spiritual life is that. In our heart of hearts, what do we feel? So, if something else is more important to us than God, then we have not started the spiritual life. We are still in the alphabet stage. We have to understand it. That's why Narada points out, first, develop that Ananyata, Ananya Bhakti towards God. God is everything to me. That idea must come to us. We must love God so much that God is all important for us. So then, Narada points out that Puja Adishu Anuragaha. There are spiritual practices where we worship God, formal worship. In the same way we chant the name of God. In the same way we listen to the words of God, Bhagavata and other scriptures. In the same way Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita, etc. We listen to the words of God and we talk about God among ourselves. These are all the means, what we call the Satsangam. So in that Kathadishu, Anuragaha, Narada Maharshi again points out, Anuraga, there also we must have that love. Anuraga. Anuraga is a kind of attachment, loving attachment. We must develop attachment towards God. Because we are human beings, we have something called emotion in us. And this emotion requires a support. And this support must be very strong and unchangeable. Unfortunately, what happens when we try to get attached to something in this world, they keep on changing. What they are today are not tomorrow. Place, things, persons, everything, they go on changing. And then what happens? Because of this, we are not able to stabilize our emotion. The only means is to get attached to God. If we are not attached to God, we get attached to something else, because that is what is the emotion. Somehow or the other, we get attached to something else which is temporary, which ultimately results in getting into misery, different kinds of miseries. That is, the best way is to attach to God. Then, when we have that attachment towards God, when we talk about God, what happens? So, there is the love. When we worship God, formal worship, there is that devotion. And again, when we read about God, there is that devotion. So when we talk about God, there is devotion. So as long as this love for God, this devotion is there, then this action will have meaning. Otherwise, it becomes only formality. So that is why Kathadishu Anuragaha. Then he also Puja Adishu Anuraga. And Kathadishu. Katha means this Satsanga and other things. So there also again, love of God we must have. Then Atma Rati Avirodhena. we engage ourselves in meditation and other spiritual practices. Even there also again, we must have this love. That means bhakti, anuraga, attachment to God. Suppose I don't have devotion to God and I sit for meditation 3-4 hours, I go on meditating. Many people do that. But then, what happens? Time is spent, but then we are unable to do the real thing. That's what's called the meditation. We spend the time, no doubt, but then we are unable to do the real thing, that is meditation. Because without meditation, what is the meaning? Without devotion, what is the meaning of meditation? It is like, Basman neva juhoti saha. It is like doing homa. So a person was doing homa in ash. There was no fire at all. Go on giving ahuti, one after another. But then there was no fire, only ash. So the benefit will be only that much. That is why even there also again devotion to God. And Narada points out at last, Tadarpita akhila acharata tatvismarane parama vyakulata. If we want to lead a spiritual life, constantly we have to remember God. Constant remembrance of God. And all our actions must be devoted to God and God alone. In all our action, we must bring God. And they must be dedicated to God and God alone. Tadarpita akhila acharati. That is why Narada says that you do not have to go and taking up some other profession, etc. Whatever profession you are having now, you can follow that. Only thing is, instead of doing it for someone else, when you go and work in the office, instead of trying to please boss, you should try to please God. Sri Ramakrishna. That's what should happen. And when you try to do business, there only just instead of just thinking about the profit, what you have to think, it is dedicated to Sri Ramakrishna. So sincerity must come there. When we try to bring Sri Ramakrishna in all these things, God in all our actions, then what happens? That supports our spiritual life. That is what the basics means. Without doing that basics, then if we try to do lot of meditation and all those things, which ultimately leads to nothing. Because we will be spending time in spiritual practices, but basic thing, that the devotion, if that is absent, then what happens? We start calculating. I always give one simple example. One gentleman went to hear a beautiful discourse by a Swamiji. Swamiji was talking about God, who is present in all the jivas. Ishvara sarvabhutanam hrideshe arjuna tishtati. God is there in the heart of all beings, all the jivas. So then he was explaining, even in elephant also there is God. Even in camel also there is God. Even in insect, even in ant, God is present. When he explained thus, this gentleman was listening to that. For the first time he had gone to listen a spiritual discourse. I was a businessman. He came back next day. So this gentleman was a businessman. Next day he went to his shop and did business and cheated only 2 customers. Came back home and evening he went to his kitchen garden behind his house. There was a line of ants. He was feeding the ants with sugar. His friend was surprised because such a stingy person would never spend even a single paisa without any benefit. Such a person was feeding the ants. And he came and was surprised. Why are you feeding the ants? Oh, don't you know? God is there even in them also. That's why I am feeding them. So then, oh, is it? Then he told, do you know how much punya I am getting now? See, I have treated only 2 Atmas and I am satisfying hundreds of Atmas here. Now you see, when there is no devotion, ultimately it leads to this kind of calculation. You are a single person, if you cheat also according to religion, according to spiritual, this thing it's wrong. You cannot tell even half-truth. So that's what is the real spiritual life. What he says, his calculation, is a businessman. And even there also he is applying his method. What is the reason? Reason is that devotion is absent. So that is the basic. That is the basic thing. So that is why we have to develop more and more devotion to God. What we need to do is that try to find out in our heart. You know why we chant the God, now God's name and everything. At least every day, 3-4 minutes we have to take out. And how much devotion really I have developed, how much attachment to God that I have developed. This is the question we have to ask and try to get an honest answer to that. And we have to again find out what is that? Am I becoming better? Am I becoming better in our daily life? So this will help us actually ultimately to develop this what you call devotion to God. Because when we follow this, where even simple talk of God must be done with devotion, reading Bhagavata, Shri Ramakrishna Kathamrita, etc., love to God, doing all our action as a dedication to God, in meditation again love of God, in every action of ours which ultimately is dedicated to God, God-centered life. When we lead that, naturally, step by step, gradually we develop more and more devotion to God, which ultimately leads in us realizing God who is not only in us but who is everywhere. And that gives us immense joy, because that's what we are trying to find out, that peace and that joy, and that is possible when we follow these basics. So that is why, think about this. First of all, are we perfecting these basics? First and foremost thing. If that is not there, then the superstructure of spiritual life is going to be a failure. That's why we must analyze ourselves and let us pray to Sri Ramakrishna, Mother Sharda Devi and Swami Vivekananda, so that this effort of ours will ultimately lead us to perfect the means, that means our spiritual life, for which all of us are trying. Om Niranjanam Nityamanantarupam Bhaktanukampadhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidhyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamah.